AMD's FSR has been updated to version 3.1, and XeSS has released an update to all of its Sony ports, adding support for the new version of the image reconstruction technology. What improvements can be found over the last version? How does the new version 3.1, compare to the other graphic vendors' image reconstruction techniques? That is all this video is about today on DF, but before I get into the comparisons, I want to first explain a bit of the footage I've made here. In making this video, I originally planned to use my archived footage I had collected previously of FSR 2.2, though due to a hardware issue, I think my archived footage is lost. Thankfully though, the XeSS ports with FSR 3.1 include the ability to roll back to the last patch, which makes these comparisons trivial. With that, I've decided to make the lion's share of the comparisons here in Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, as the game has a good save system and easy repeatability in comparison to the other games, which may pose issues due to being open world games. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk about FSR 3.1. FSR 3.1 updates the spatial temporal upscaler in an attempt to increase quality, and it also updates frame generation so that it now works with any image quality treatment. That means you can use FSR 3 frame generation with DLSS, no AA, XeSS, or whatever you really want. Frame generation though is not the focus of this video, rather image reconstruction is. To test that out, I looked at Ratchet & Clank as I mentioned earlier, specifically honing in on 1440p balance mode. Technically 4x scaling, like 1080p to 4K or 720p to 1440p, is the most interesting case for image reconstruction as it is the hardest to do, but with 1440p in the balance mode, I first cover the base of 1440p, which is the ever more popular resolution according to the Steam hardware survey, and I've chosen balance mode here as a middle ground of sorts of quality. FSR has historically had its issues below quality mode 4K, and I think this 1440p balance mode will still show off issues that we would otherwise see in performance mode, while just being a bit more of a realistic use case. With that being said, let us get right into the comparisons. First with the still camera shot here. This is one area where AMD directly referenced it as being better than the previous version of FSR. If you look here in the background, you'll see that SSAO is undersampled, causing big stability issues with the previous version of FSR. This is true even with the game being super sampled, as we can see here on the right. Even with 4 times SSAA, SSAO is going to flicker. So here is a post-process element causing flicker, and with FSR 3.1, it is indeed improved over FSR 2.2. Flickering is reduced. This makes the image more stable over time and easier on the eyes. The flicker of SSAO there is still visible, I would say, in version 3.1, but it is a good deal better than it is before. And if you think about it, this means FSR here is better than super sampling quality for this image quality aspect. That goes to show how spatial super sampling is limited in ways how it can improve an image. So in this sense, FSR 3.1 has improved temporal stability over the previous version when the camera is still for this screen element. Another example of an improvement is with specular flicker I found when the camera is still. Here with FSR 2.2, the sunlight bouncing off the tiny metal inlays on the glass here causes flicker. The camera is still here and so is the ground actually. This issue here of flicker is caused by the sub-pixel jitter of FSR. Those bright specks of light are small, and since FSR is constantly changing each frame where it is sampling, this leads to a constant change and single pixel flicker of light. If you look at that shot when super sampled, there's no such thing occurring since it is not working temporally. With SSAA, I would still say the highlights are undersampled here, as they should realistically form a line, but I would still say that SSAA here is of course better. Going to FSR 3.1, we can see how the flickering is still occurring, but its rapidity and intensity have been reduced. It's still obviously unstable, but it is better than it was before. Another example of still camera improvement occurs with some subpixel detail, like we can see in this shot here. In FSR 2.2, the tree background here, the handrails next to it, and the building detail, and all the other thin lines are flickering and changing with each frame, causing some intense flicker overall. Like with the light flicker I showed earlier, this is improved in FSR 3.1, leading to the tree's internal surface having less flicker in it, but also some of the other details in the shot are more stable. There is still flicker and instability there, of course, but it is lessened in comparison to how it was in 2.2. This shot also shows us another small improvement versus FSR 2.2 with the spinning apparatus in the front here. It is a slight difference, but it looks a smidge less pixelated in FSR 3.1 than it did in version 2.2, which gives it a more stable look over time. If you pause the frame, that'll be more visible. Internal detail and some of the edges have a less pixelated look in version 3.1. That look is still there technically to a degree, but it is lessened in comparison to 2.2. This echoes the findings of my preview from DF Direct, where I looked at Horizon Forbidden West. There, the moving object was Aloy, and she had a less pixelated look in movement in 3.1 than she did in 2.2. The pixelation and aliasing issues were still there, but it was a tick better than it was before.
Grand Marshals of Art Parade, Ratchet and Clank!
Another improvement I found was with some objects that lack motion vectors. Like here in this shot with the tiny confetti falling from the sky. Here in 2.2 there were trails behind each individual piece of confetti that have now lessened in version 3.1. Though now in version 3.1 they are undersampled and wispy, making them kind of disappear. You can see that they're disappearing in comparison to the super sampling shot where each individual piece of confetti is visible at this distance. So FSR 3.3 is improving here the amount of ghosting, but it's also inadvertently making particles disappear in an inaccurate way. Altogether, these are the positive differences I have seen between FSR 3.1 and 2.2 in Ratchet & Clank. 3.1 typically has less sub-pixel flicker in shots when the camera is still. It also has a slightly less pixelated look for things in motion, though that is a more slight difference. And some particle effects that lack motion vectors can have less ghosting than they did before, although now they will inaccurately disappear at the same distance. Altogether, the list of improvements is actually shorter than the list of the things that have stayed the same, and a number of things have not improved in any substantial manner. The ray traced reflections in Ratchet & Clank when undersampled still have issues with flickering, and in fact, only DLSS and super sampling managed to resolve this correctly. Another issue is that moving particles still have a blocky and ghosty look, even though it can be reduced in comparison to version 2.2. You can see that in this scene here when Ratchet grabs the wrench. The blue particles spawned upon grabbing the wrench look ghosty and pixelated. So some key problem areas are largely untouched by this update in spite of some small improvements in other areas. So this means in general that FSR 3.1 still has the same stability issues that the previous versions have. That means edges on movement are aliased, things that are moving look pixelated, and areas behind moving objects still fizzle. If you compare to other upscalers, you can see what I mean. When this animation plays, I want you to pay attention to Ratchet and Clank and the area around the animations. If you look at the FSR side of things, you'll see some fizzle occurring, as well as a kind of aliased look. The reasons for this are multiple, but if we pause, we can see what is happening. Objects that move with FSR still have a blown out pixelated look to them in version 3.1, where the pixels are not anti-aliased and they're large. This gives FSR its distinct raw pixelated look, whereas XeSS and DLSS keep objects like Clank and Ratchet anti-aliased, making them look higher resolution in aggregate. Another thing to look at is the area behind the animation. Notice how the area in front of Ratchet has a good deal of aliasing in it. Each of the aliases are surrounded by an over-sharpened halo. One must not forget that FSR has a version of sharpening built into it. This kind of blown out over sharpening that happens on background objects when foreground objects reveal them is called disocclusion fizzle. This still happens with FSR 3.1 and is one of the core reasons why it still looks unstable in motion in comparison to other techniques. Things that move can look pixelated and they definitely lack anti-aliasing. You can see this well if you compare to DLSS. This character here, for example, is a lot more pixelated and aliased looking in FSR 3.1 than DLSS here. This happens in every frame of this character's animation. So over time, that moving element on screen will look lower res in aggregate, and it'll also flicker more since the aliasing is changing with each frame. Same with the particles that I mentioned earlier. The particles below that robot character kind of look low res, and you can see that very well if you look at the sign being projected above the character. There you can see that particle effects in general in FSR 3.1 still have issues, where they can look low res and they can look ghosty in comparison to other techniques. DLSS here is attempting to increase the particle's resolution and prevent aliasing. FSR seemingly cannot, and this has been something that FSR has done for a long time. Depending upon how prominent particles are, like we see on this pirate ship, on the fuse there, they can look really obviously pixelated. Or as I showed off earlier, if particles are small enough, they may just disappear from existence like we see with the confetti. DLSS and XeSS resolve them much better, I would say, and closer to the way supersampling does. The general issue with particles is that things that lack motion vectors have issues with FSR. You can see this as well with the diegetic HUD elements in the game. This weapon buying menu with 3D models projected into it doesn't really have motion vectors most likely, and FSR here has trouble differentiating the 3D element from the surface it is on, so you'll see smearing and aliasing on the left here. DLSS on the right gives it anti-aliasing, and it lacks that smeared look. These type of comparisons to XeSS, or DLSS in particular, show that FSR, even after version 3.1, has room for improvement. And those areas that FSR 3.1 improved on, like the stability of an image, are still worse than the peers. Take for example here, this shot of the tree I showed earlier. FSR 3.1 is better than 2.2 here, but when compared to something like DLSS, we can see that the stability of things like the handrail and the tree, or even the moving apparatus, well, they're better in DLSS, and by a good margin, I would say. Based upon this update, FSR 3.1 is improving things, but the core issues remain. Moving objects, revealed backgrounds, objects lacking motion vectors, particles, and more still cause issues for the reconstruction technique. Given how these issues exist since FSR 2 came out 2 years ago, and how other techniques don't have the same issues to the same degree, well, I think that means that FSR in its current form is perhaps not capable of solving the current issues without greater iteration. So perhaps a change in technique is now warranted. As DLSS and XeSS can show, machine learning corrections to image reconstruction can help sort these issues out, and that is perhaps a path AMD could look to next, given the current stagnation that we see. Sony is going to be using machine learning for their image reconstruction technique called PSSR that will come out with the PS5 Pro, and that is going to be running on AMD hardware. So perhaps that is a path AMD could and should go down next. But machine learning is not the only method for improvement, I would say. Based on Epic's work with TSR, which is its reconstruction technique in UE5, we can see there that you don't necessarily need machine learning techniques to get better results overall. I would say Epic's technique of TSR looks better on moving objects than FSR. So maybe FSR can crib off of that to help things out in the meantime. Getting to the end of this video, I would say that FSR 3.1 is an iterative improvement over the previous version, and you can specifically see the improvements with the stability of detail when the camera is still. Nonetheless, the core issues of FSR remain, and I think the technique needs to be advanced in some new direction, as proven by other techniques like XeSS or DLSS, should AMD want to remain competitive in the space. As it is, version 3.1 of FSR doesn't change the hierarchy of quality that we saw before. FSR is still notably at the bottom, with XeSS typically above it, and DLSS at the top. After looking at FSR again for this video, I definitely see the places where improvements could and should occur, and I hope AMD does something about it. Anyway, if you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. Support us on Patreon, comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.
Don't beat yourself up. This'll be just like old times.